Hey, congratulations. You've got yourself an NFL head coach and you're super excited about it. But then you go to the internet and you discover, turns out, according to the internet, I'll never have a shot at winning a Super Bowl with a defensive-minded head coach. It's all about the offense these days. We should have hired somebody like one of these other offensive gurus who have never won a Super Bowl if we're really taking this seriously. Don't worry about it. I have a foolproof 3-part plan for obtaining and sustaining continued offensive success despite having a defensive-minded head coach. So you won't pay a penalty for hiring somebody who can inspire, lead, and motivate, as opposed to some offensive whiz kid who still eats his own boogers. First part of the plan, and this is going to be the, well, duh, Seth. You got to draft a good quarterback. You got to trade for a good quarterback. You have to find a good quarterback. That is true whether you're an offensive-minded coach, a defensive-minded coach, or what have you. So that's 1A, finding the good quarterback. 1B is finding the absolute best coordinator for that quarterback, even if it's a guy who might get plucked away in a couple of years because he's such a good offensive coordinator that somebody wants to make him a head coach. Because don't you know? Everybody's supposed to be an offensive mind these days if you're a head coach. So don't fear that part. We've got a plan for that part. Get that great coordinator, pay him whatever it takes. Maybe you'll have to pay him a little bit extra to keep him around for an extra year. Pay him $20 million. It doesn't matter. In those formative years for your young quarterback, you have to be willing to spend and pay and commit to a really good young offensive coordinator. But not just any brilliant young offensive coordinator, a very specific type. Number 2 in this plan is that coordinator needs to be from Kubshanistan. That is somebody who is raised up and understands, has worked in for an extended period of time in a Kubiak, Shanahan, Sean McVay type of system. Something that's heavy on zone running and play action and a lot of the same passing concepts. Why? One, because I think it's the superior model, and that's borne out by how many dominant offenses right now in the NFL are running some version of that offense. But 2, and this is critical, and this is even more crucial than the system itself. This might work with a lesser offensive system, but you want to have an offense that lots of teams are running because it makes it easier and simpler that after you have some offensive success and your original offensive coordinator gets plucked away from you, you can go out and find guys and have a larger pool of replacement coaches, either as offensive coordinators or guys that can come in and become the receivers coach after you elevate your receivers coach. And this is critical basically because it comes down to economies of scale. Think of the Concorde airplane. Kids, the Concorde airplane was a supersonic jet that could carry people from New York to London in like 27 minutes. It was absurd. The problem was there were only so many Concorde jets because you're not allowed to fly supersonic aircraft over land. They had a limited number of airplanes. When you have a limited number of airplanes, that means you've got a limited number of replacement parts. You've got a limited number of mechanics that work on these airplanes. You've got a limited number of pilots who are checked out to fly on them. So it becomes obtrusively expensive and inconvenient every time you have to replace a part or make a repair. NFL offenses are the same way. If you're running the Tom Brady system, it becomes really hard to run that offense with quarterbacks or offensive coordinators who aren't deeply steeped in that system. It's not impossible, obviously, but it works a lot better that way. And don't worry, I understand there's a contradiction there. We'll get to how Belichick makes it work in part 3 of the plan. But you want to be using an offense that so many teams in the league are using, that so many coaches understand, because then your young quarterback, if he loses his coordinator after 2 years, isn't all of a sudden having to, in addition learning these year 3 lessons, have to learn new terminology, new concepts, new proclivities of whatever the offensive coordinator likes to do. Those changes will be much, much smaller if it's somebody from Kubshanistan. So yes, am I biased towards the Kubshanistani? I am. I don't think that should get me canceled in this day and age. Number 3, you need to build a pipeline of coaches, a rock-solid, stocked to the brim pipeline of young up-and-coming geniuses who can become your new position coaches, your new offensive coordinators, your replacement parts from those hard-to-replace vehicles. And this is where I'm going to borrow from Bill Belichick heavily, and I'll do it without shame because nobody sustained a longer period of offensive success despite being a defensive-minded head coach than Bill Belichick, maybe Tom Landry back in the day. But it was astoundingly effective, and part of it was just simply this. He hires assistant coaches who will get opportunities to be head coaches because they're part of a good squad, but guys who don't necessarily have the personality traits of good head coaches. So what happens with those guys who inevitably go on and fail at their new venues? They end up back with Bill Belichick, and it is brilliant. And I think a lot of times people used to think, oh, well, Belichick's just sending these guys out there to sabotage these other teams. I'm not so sure, and I don't know if this was part of a plan, but it sure has worked out this way to where guys like Josh McDaniels and Bill O'Brien have been the coordinators of his offense for almost an unbroken 20 years. It's really astounding. And last year you saw what happens when he doesn't have one of those two guys in his offense. And it's because Josh McDaniels, at least for a long stretch of his younger years, really wasn't great head coach material. And Bill O'Brien, by the time it came time to replace Josh McDaniels, had been in that system for a little while. So there's a certain personality type, but there's also this pipeline of coaches that Bill Belichick, at least at one time, had built up in his offensive system. It's tough when you have success because you're constantly having good talent pulled away from you. This is the antidote to that. You have to become like a baseball team is, like the Astros are, where they focus so much time and energy in their pipeline into teaching consistent methods, consistent techniques, so that when you go from A to AA to AAA on up into the majors, a lot of the same themes and a lot of the same lessons are being driven home and talked about. And that has a cumulative compounding effect really on how good you can be. If your team has a defensive-minded head coach, you absolutely must treat your offensive staff like it's an academy for offensive coordinators, an academy perhaps for future college head coaches. Get them that way. Send them off to college, and then they can also provide you information on prospects coming up, not to mention teaching a lot of what you're going to end up doing on offense. You create a minor league system of offensive coaches, and then ideally along the way you're going to find guys who are offensive coordinator material, but perhaps not head coach material. They just lack the dynamic personalities that a guy like DeMeco Ryans has, and that's how you make it all work. Simple. 1, 2, 3. Hardest part of that, unfortunately, is number one, finding the quality quarterback. If it makes you feel better, that system has gotten some pretty incredible performances and above expectation performances out of guys who are either past their prime or perhaps just didn't have all that much physical potential, but they took it to the brink or ultimately succeeded with the Kubshanistan system. Get yourself a Kubshanistani. It feels weird to say that, but let's remember that's not actually a race, ethnicity, or nation on this earth.
Well, it's always exciting flying supersonic, and it's always exciting to get to New York before you